The desert woke beneath a sky the color of rusted gold, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain that would never come. A stallion stood at the edge of the horizon, mane torn by the breeze, eyes dark with the knowledge of distance. Around him, the herd stirred, a shifting constellation of muscle and breath, bound not by fences but by hunger and instinct. They were America's Mustangs, survivors and inheritance both wild and forgotten. The matriarch moved first. Sable, gray as ash, strong despite the years, stepped forward, hooves striking the earth with the rhythm of memory. She had led her herd through droughts and wildfires, through storms that erased rivers and roads alike. Beside her, a young colt, Ashwind, trembled with unspent life. His coat still held the softness of youth, but his gaze carried questions too large for his small frame. Where the water had gone, why the wind sometimes mourned. Far in the distance, the faint hum of machinery rose, a sound older Mustangs had learned to fear. The wind shifted, heavy with the metallic tang of man. Yet here, under this early light, all that existed was motion. The herd moving through sage and silence, every step a defiance against disappearance. Sable led them toward a dry riverbed, its stones smooth from floods that no longer came. The cracked basin reflected a fragment of the sun, as if pretending to be water. Ashwin lowered his head to drink, but the earth gave him nothing. He pawed at the dust, confused, and Sable pressed close, her breast steady against his neck. In that small touch was a language older than words. Survive! Move on! Remember! Behind them, the wind carried whispers of their ancestors, the first horses brought by conquistadors centuries ago, whose descendants had slipped from saddles into freedom. But freedom was no promise now. It was hunger, thirst, the endless search for what remained. The land itself seemed to test them, demanding proof of their right to exist. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp and fleeting, like a warning or a prayer. When dusk came, the horizon bled orange. The herd gathered on a ridge where the light caught in their coats like fire. For a moment, it seemed the world had forgotten to move. Sable raised her head, nostrils flaring, sensing something beyond sight, a change coming with the next wind. She did not know of the men charting the range below, or the machines that would soon cut through the silence. She only knew the air had shifted. Ashwind pressed closer, heart racing with the pulse of everything untamed. The sun slipped behind the dunes, and for a breath, the desert held its silence. Then Sable began to walk again, slow, deliberate, carrying her herd into the deepening dusk, toward a horizon that promised nothing, and that, somehow, was enough. Morning rose pale and uncertain, brushing the desert in a thin wash of silver. The storm had passed in the night. No rain, only wind and the illusion of mercy. In its wake, the Mustangs moved slower, ribs showing beneath dust-caked hides. Sable walked at the front, her stride uneven, yet her eyes held the stubborn light of command. Behind her, Ashwind stumbled, still learning the rhythm of scarcity. His youth was fading quickly in this land that asked too much from the living. Far from a ridge, a woman knelt beside a jeep half buried in sand, adjusting her lens toward the herd. Eleanor Ridge had been out here for weeks, tracking what remained of the wild bands. Her notebooks were filled with sketches and coordinates, but her reasons were more human than scientific. She sought proof that freedom still existed in something ungoverned, something that refused to yield. Through her camera, she found Sable's herd and exhaled softly, as though greeting old friends she'd never met. Eleanor's voice recorder clicked on. Subject, Mare Gray, approximately 15 years. Leading group of 9, possibly more. Condition, worsening terrain, limited forage. Yet even as she spoke, her tone carried wonder. The horses moved like a single thought, shaped by wind and instinct, unspoiled by the weight of language. Watching them, she forgot the government reports and quotas that filled her inbox. Here, statistics dissolved into silhouettes and dust. The hum reached her before she saw the source. A distant thrum, rhythmic and rising. She lifted her binoculars just as a helicopter breached the canyon edge, its shadow cutting across the desert like a blade. Her pulse quickened. Not again. She reached for the radio but stopped. Orders were orders, and she was only an observer. Her job was to record, not interfere. Still, her hand shook. Below, the herd scattered. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Sable reared. Ashwind pressed against her flank, eyes wide with terror. The machine descended, metal shrieking against sky. Eleanor watched helplessly as the horses ran. Their flight pure and desperate, the kind born from memory older than fear. Dust engulfed them, a living storm. Through the haze, she glimpsed Ashwind break away. Too young, too fast, veering from the others toward open emptiness. Sable called, her cry raw, unanswered. Eleanor's heart twisted. She could not move, could only witness. The helicopter curved, chasing what should never be chased. When silence finally returned, it came heavy and hollow. The herd was gone, the desert scarred with their prints. Eleanor sank to her knees beside her camera, its red light still blinking. She whispered into the wind, "We forget they belong to no one." The sun climbed higher, unfeeling. She closed her notebook with a trembling hand, already knowing she would return tomorrow. Something had broken today, not only in the herd, but in her, too. Steel fences glinted beneath the sun, slicing to the dry wind that once carried freedom. The Mustangs stood within narrow pens, their hooves tracing circles into the dust. The air smelled of sweat and metal, of something once alive now confined. Among them was Ashwind, thinner now, his mane dulled to the color of sand. He no longer ran when the gates clanged shut. Instead, he stared toward the horizon beyond the wire, where the wind still moved without boundaries. Eleanor stood outside the enclosure, clipboard in hand. Though she hadn't written a word in hours, her job was to assess document, remain detached. But detachment had become impossible. The horses she once watched through lenses were here now, numbers instead of beings. Each tag around their necks felt like a betrayal she hadn't meant to commit. Her eyes kept finding Ashwind, the colt who had veered from his herd that day. Something in his quiet defiance mirrored the guilt that had followed her since the roundup. The man beside her adjusted his hat, squinting through the glare. Thomas Cole, rancher turned volunteer, moved with the slow patience of someone who had lived too long under open sky. "They don't eat well for the first few days," he said softly. "Takes time before they trust the ground again." His voice carried no judgment, only sorrow disguised as calm. Eleanor nodded, watching him step into the pen. He didn't bring ropes or commands, only a bucket of water and an old tune hummed low in his throat. The horses shifted but didn't flee. Thomas stopped a few feet from Ashwind and waited. The young stallion's ears flicked, uncertain. The man lowered his gaze, set the bucket down, and stepped back. Patience was his only language. Minutes stretched. Then, with a cautious step, Ashwind approached. Eleanor lifted her camera, then lowered it again. The moment didn't belong behind glass. It was something fragile, sacred, a bridge built from silence. She felt a strange warmth rise in her chest, a quiet realization that maybe redemption wasn't found in saving everything, but in standing near what's been lost without turning away. That evening, Thomas leaned against the fence, wiping dust from his hands. "You can't keep wild things caged forever," he said. "They'll stop breathing even while they stand." His eyes found hers. "You know that, don't you?" Eleanor didn't answer, but her throat tightened. She watched Ashwind lift his head toward the distant hills, nostrils flaring at a wind he could no longer reach. When she left that night, Thomas remained by the corral, humming softly to the restless herd. The moon rose pale and cold, washing silver over steel and bone. From the road, Eleanor looked back once. The Mustang still stood by the fence, staring into the darkness as though it remembered something the world had chosen to forget. Dawn came quietly, soft as breath. The desert stretched beneath a pale band of light. Eleanor stood by the open trailer, her hands trembling around the worn halter Thomas once used. His note rested in her pocket, creased from too many readings. Set him free. The desert knows his name better than we ever could. She looked at Ashwind, older now, his muscles lean, his eyes steady. He had outgrown the fences, outlasted the waiting. Freedom, once taken from him, waited just beyond the ridge. The gate creaked as she pulled the latch. The sound startled a hawk from a nearby post. It rose swiftly, circling overhead, wings catching the morning sun. For a heartbeat, the world felt weightless. Ashwind hesitated, his hooves shifting against the packed earth. He looked at her, not with fear but with recognition, as if sensing the purpose behind her silence. Eleanor stepped aside, the halter falling from her hand. "Go!" she whispered, though the word barely carried. He moved with sudden grace, bursting into motion, dust swirling around him in golden spirals. Each stride stretched farther, stronger, until he was no longer a captive creature, but the echo of what the land once was. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor watched until the shape of him blurred into light. Beyond the dunes, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a small herd grazing near the horizon. Among them, unmistakable, stood Sable, her gray coat glinting faintly under the sun. The distance between them was vast, yet in that instant it vanished. The young stallion slowed head high, and a low, trembling call left his throat. The herd lifted theirs in answer. He crossed the final stretch like a returning prayer. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, feeling something lift, a release long delayed. The desert wind moved through her hair, carrying with it the rhythm of hooves, the sound of belonging restored. She thought of Thomas, of his quiet mercy, of the way he spoke to the wild as though it could understand. Maybe it always had. Maybe the wild was listening still. The sun rose higher, washing the land in white fire. The herd had disappeared beyond the ridge, swallowed by distance, yet the sound of them lingered, faint but alive. Eleanor crouched by the fire pit they had once shared and unfolded the letter one last time. The ink had faded, but the words were enough. "He's home." She fed the paper to the flame. The smoke rose thin and straight, joining the sky without resistance. Around her, the desert shimmered, unbroken, unclaimed. For the first time, she felt small in a way that was merciful. She closed her eyes and listened, not to the silence, but to what filled it. Somewhere far ahead, the wind carried the promise of running hooves, and she smiled through tears, knowing some wild things are meant only to be remembered.